We are live.
Welcome back to the House Judiciary Committee this Wednesday afternoon, April 29th, and we're going to look at a amended or draft number 3.1 of S208, which I asked Legislative Council, given various conversations, to put together for me after we saw the Ninth Circuit opinion as an alternative approach. So, Sophie, if you could join us and walk us through this draft number 3.1.
Good afternoon. So Peter Gattney for the Office of Legislative Counsel. I had a couple of follow-up points I was going to make in response to questions that were raised last time, but most of them were raised by Representative Goodnow, so I'll just follow up with him separately. I think will be easiest. And if that's okay with you, I will go ahead and put up the draft amendment. So as noted, this is draft number 3.1 of S208. And essentially, this just takes a different approach to the approach that in the bill that came over from the Senate. And this would move forward with a statewide model policy on law enforcement identification standards. So this moves away from covering federal law enforcement officers and focuses just on the state. Section A retains the three definitions that were in the last version of S208 before this. And then subsection B provides that on or before July 1 of 2027, the Law Enforcement Advisory Board shall establish a model statewide policy governing the standards for law enforcement identification and the wearing of facial coverings applicable to law enforcement officers to ensure consistent statewide application of the standards. And then subsection C provides that on or before October 1, 2027, and again, I just put that date in, it's 3 months later, but again, that's something the committee can decide if that's an appropriate or sufficient length of time. So on or before October 1, 2027, every law enforcement agency shall adopt a policy consistent with the model statewide policy developed by the Law Enforcement Advisory Board pursuant to the previous section. If a law enforcement agency or law enforcement officer who's not employed by a law enforcement agency fails to adopt a policy pursuant to this section, then the agency or officer shall be deemed to have adopted the model statewide policy developed by the Law Enforcement Advisory Board. And then this retains that this would take effect on passage.
Questions for Sophie on that?
I did look at other provisions under state law where policies have been directed to be developed. So I did have a couple of things that the committee might want to think about, which is whether there should be any guiding language included in this. I mean, right now it's just develop a model policy, but doesn't provide any parameters on that. Whether there should be training by the Criminal Justice Council that's included in some other previous legislation. And then whether there should be a report back or check-in of some kind with the General Assembly. So right now, the Law Enforcement Advisory Board does an annual report that comes in January of each year, but whether there was some specific request for a check-in.
Right. So those are some issues everything that's talked about, but any particular questions? I don't see it. You said you had some answers for previous questions.
I did. So last time there were a couple of questions that came up. So one was whether there had been any lawsuits filed against the New Jersey law, which is with New Jersey being in the Third Circuit, the other Washington and Oregon being in the Ninth Circuit. And there, so far there has not been, but when the law was signed, it was clear that and litigation was anticipated. And in the signing of the law, the governor of New Jersey was clear that they anticipated litigation and they were prepared to stand behind the law. But as far as when I looked at this yesterday, they had not yet, nothing had been filed by the US Department of Justice. There was also a question around the Ninth Circuit and reviewing decisions of a panel en banc. And I think, as Julio Thompson noted yesterday, because the Ninth Circuit is so large, they do a modified en banc. So it's not all the judges on the Circuit Court of Appeals. They have 11 judges that do it, but it is very rare. So in 2024, 625 en banc petitions were filed, 29 cases were called for a vote, and 9 votes succeeded. And in 2018, only 8 out of 955 petitions were granted. So it's sort of very long odds as to whether or not the Ninth Circuit would take up a case en banc. And then I was also asked a question regarding sort of where the circuit courts of appeal fall. And there was a question about, the Ninth Circuit is more liberal. How many degrees in is that? So I did ask AI, like.
I did too. Same thing.
So it said it's still generally.
Trust me.
No. Well, I was just curious because it does change over time as different administrations come and go and they get to appoint judges. And one of the things they look at is who appointed the judges that are currently on the court. So, for example, the Second Circuit which is the one we're in, did switch to have a Republican majority, but then most recently now switched back to having a liberal majority. So it does change over time. But yeah, it was, so the Ninth Circuit is still considered liberal. It's just, it used to be such an outlier and now it has come in a little bit, right? And there was one other, the First Circuit is now considered the most liberal and the Ninth Circuit the second. But they did note that it's trending more moderate. So, and the Second Circuit is viewed as liberal, but it's also viewed as quirky in that it sometimes does unexpected decisions, was what I noted. One of the other questions that came up was how has the Second Circuit looked at the intergovernmental immunity doctrine? And I think, as you've heard several times, there's just very little case law on the intergovernmental immunity doctrine, and then the Second Circuit has not dived into that. The only intergovernmental immunity doctrine cases they have involve tax immunity. So, like relating to taxes, alimony, and whatever. So nothing that would be relevant to this. So it would be very hard to predict what the Second Circuit could do if they were confronted with S208 as it was originally drafted.
Thank you.
Chief Burke just joined.
Oh, well, perfect. So any other questions for Sophie at this point? I don't see it. So, all right, why don't we go to Chief Burke then?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your flexibility this afternoon, Chief.
Oh, you as well. You as well. Thanks. The minute I had 30 minutes open, it got filled. So.
Yes. We just had a walkthrough of draft number 3.1.
Okay, excellent. And that's what I reviewed this morning, correct?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you for sending the most recent draft in advance of testimony here today, and taking it in, really comparing it with what VACOP membership has shared with us in terms of the need for this bill. We still, question its purpose because we know the focus really is on how federal agents operate in our communities, and we've certainly seen how that has been harmful in a lot of ways. We do, appreciate this version, sending it to the LEAB to study it as a matter of policy across all law enforcement operations seems reasonable to us, and we again appreciate being brought in as part of the conversation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
I had a couple questions as far as the statement. It's that every law enforcement agency shall adopt a policy consistent with the model statewide policy. I know that you mentioned that Burlington already has a policy involving, I don't recall if it was identification or masking. And presumably an agency like yours would take a look at the model policy to see that it's consistent with what you have locally, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's similar to how we rolled the code of conduct changes in last year. So we obviously all police agencies have a code of conduct, and we just look across the tenants and ensure that we have all the mandatory elements of any state model policy within, to bring it back to identification and masking. So we have a directive on how you have to wear your uniform and where your name tag goes, and how, in terms of mask, we're allowed to wear a neoprene style mask with the face exposed when it's cold out. So we would have to ensure that, we preserve that, and then look at other considerations that we have, whether or not we're responding to a biohazard situation or whatever else a model policy will actually
Right.
contemplate. Sometimes it's easier to just adopt the model policy in whole, as opposed to blending it into others. But that is a bit of the beauty of the flexibility of some of these model policies, is that it's not necessarily you shall adopt every single word, but rather you need to adopt the essential elements.
Right, okay. And would you perceive there is a need for requiring training for this policy? Would it already kind of be covered by code of conduct type training that is provided, or would you suggest, well, what do you suggest regarding training? Let me just ask it simply like that.
It's a little tough to predict what training needs may come out of a policy that doesn't exist, but I would think something as basic as how and when you identify yourself as a law enforcement officer could be rolled into the curriculum at the Vermont Police Academy. And then, for in-service officers, like I mentioned, there is a lot of this requirement in how we interact with folks on traffic stops, identifying yourself, your agency, and the reason for the stop. There's an identification provision within the fair and impartial policing policy, which I believe is predicated on a traffic stop and not other scenarios. So again, just looking, to have that consistency rolled out. And then in terms of masks and how they're used by any given organization, different police departments have different requirements in terms of uniforms they wear, under what conditions, and that would be a agency, responsibility to hold, train, and enforce.
So perhaps premature to designate trainees until the policy is worked on. Would the Law Enforcement Advisory Board have any recommendations as part of drafting the model policy on what training, if any, should be provided, or is that not really part of the policy?
So that may actually kind of creep out of the actual purview of the LEAB, although the director of the academy has a seat on the LEAB, so training considerations could be contemplated, of course. But I would be cautious about giving any strict guidance on training on a policy that does not exist.
Right, okay. Other questions?
Chief, it's good to see you again, and always appreciate your counsel on this. So I guess my first question is, I don't know if you have the draft legislation in front of you.
I do.
But page 1, line 20, the very first word of that line, establish. I'm curious what you would think about changing that word to consider, discuss, or draft.
I appreciate the question, and that is really it answers the question on the mind of our membership of Vermont Chiefs: is there a need for this in Vermont law enforcement? I understand, that this again was really trying to get at a federal issue that we don't have purview over, and I think the LEAB could definitely give a good opinion on the need for this. We all have different constituents that we answer to, and that is, those constituencies are really represented in whole when you think about the composition of the LEAB. And this is just not something that we are hearing, at least here in the city of Burlington, a need for strict policy on identification and masking, unless we're talking about, federal agents.
Right. And that's a point that's very well taken. Is actually jumping ahead to my third question. It's just thinking through it. And I was curious, and you've already answered this, so no need to repeat, but just thinking out loud have there been any reports of any infractions on either municipal, city, or Vermont State Police? I don't know if the commissioner or members of her team were consulted on this legislation. I wasn't part of the drafting process, but I'd be curious of what their thoughts and opinions are. Another question, and again, maybe this is for legislative counsel who's in the room, but and I'm wondering, what would the penalty be if a policy wasn't established by the LEAB, or if departments holistically across the state didn't enforce one by October 1st? I mean, there's no penalty. There's nothing saying that we have to. So, I mean, there's not really any teeth in this bill or draft legislation. It seems to me like it's more a virtue signal than it is actual meaningful legislation. But that's just more of an opinion, I guess. But I don't know if Sophie wants to talk about if there are any penalties. I mean, like what would it be what would happen if nothing was established or the policy just wasn't implemented by law enforcement across the state?
So the policy as drafted in this bill is sort of modeled on what currently is in statute. And so there really aren't any provisions in current statute that talk about that. Again, that was one of the issues I raised was, did you want to have a report back? Because that's typically what would happen if you ask someone to do something, like come back and tell us whether you did it. And then if they don't, then the legislature may want to take action. But this is sort of consistent with how this is being handled in the past.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, Chief. I don't think there's any other questions I have for you, but I just think I keep coming back to the question I ask myself is whether this is needed at all. And if we do vote on this, and if this does go out from this committee, what does it actually seek to accomplish? Because on face value, it really just seems like we've killed some more trees printing paper.
Go ahead if you want to comment, Chief.
I'll just add quickly that we are required to submit copies of our state mandated model policies with our training affidavit to the Vermont Criminal Justice Council each year. And if you don't have the right policy in place, your agency reverts to the model policy itself. So there is that degree of mechanism available to these state model policies.
Yep. Right. So the other thing I know that the other alternative, if you want to put more teeth in this, is that if an agency doesn't follow or enforce a policy, then they are not allowed to have their law enforcement trained at the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. But I don't think we need to do that for this. I mean, I trust that the Law Enforcement Advisory Panel will do what we've asked them to do, and we do have the provision that the model policy gets put in place. The one thing that I would say as far as the need for the policy is I mean, I've heard different, I guess, Chief Burke, that people were concerned at what happened on March 11th, that they saw people, they thought they were state or local police, that didn't have identifications, or may have had masks. And if there's a policy that one can point to that, yeah, and they're allowed to have a mask, they did this right with identification or not. So it's almost like we have the standards, are they being followed? And I think just from what I understand from the post-action reports, that they did follow proper practices as far as masking, for instance, because of being concerned about biohazards and the like. But it would be nice to have like the policy to refer to that shows that. So that's kind of where I see the benefit of having the model policy, which is, and it's also an opportunity to make sure that we have law enforcement, given these concerns that have come up, not just from March 11th, but broader, that we should take a look to make sure that we should have the experts take a look. I'm delighted that we're not doing this, since the more we got into the statutory component, the more I said, this is micromanaging and out of our realm of expertise. That's why we turned to DPS to help us. That have the experts lay that out. And I think that is helpful. And that's why, you can comment on that as well, but you don't have to. I just wanted to lay out that I do think there's a need for this, and that's why we have this.
I'll just say that we definitely appreciate, given the evolution of this proposed legislation, where it is today. And we do feel that if there is a policy need identified by the General Assembly, that the LEAB is the right body to take up that work and construct a policy that we can operationalize.
Any other questions for Chief Burke? All right, thank you again for being available on short notice on the shifting time that we're going to have you in. So I appreciate that.
No, it's always my honor to be here. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Chief.
Take care.
Thank you. So to have a little more discussion, certainly on this bill, I mean, I laid out why I think we need to do it. I've already explained my rationale that I don't think that the other, as we got it from the Senate, is constitutional and would rather go with this policy approach. Happy to hear from other folks. Yeah, come on with that.
We didn't have the commission or anybody else come in to weigh in on the new
Well,
draft,
Yeah, they could. I mean, or, man,
just to cover our bases.
do we need to have,
I don't think.
okay, yeah, okay, all right, so the representative from DPS is here.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, Ian.
Yeah, I think I support where we've landed on this, given the constitutional issues and sort of just the evolving experience with trying to draft the legislation in a more micromanagey way. It just didn't really make sense. I didn't really have a question for the chief, but like just something I want to note is that the fact that law enforcement agencies haven't heard a concern does not mean that the concern is not there. There are a lot of people who don't feel comfortable expressing concerns to law enforcement. I have heard from my own community concerns around state and local officials being masked, and that I think it is very reasonable for Vermonters to want every department in the state to have a policy related to identification and masking. And so I think that this is a logical and reasonable way to go about ensuring that that is true for every department. And I think the fact that federal action is what has brought to light this concern for Vermonters as it relates to local, state law enforcement is fine. That is a reasonable reason for this to come into people's minds as a concern that they want to have addressed. And I find that to be just a good way for this to be put before us and to ensure that we're listening to our constituents and making sure that Vermonters are heard when it comes to how they want their local and state level law enforcement to be engaged in the community. And so I'm appreciative of where we landed here and that we're going to be putting it in the hands of experts to come up with the right model policy. Yeah, I look forward to voting for it if we're going to stick with this language.
Tom, then Barbara.
Obviously, I want to get something off my chest here, having worn a uniform for 40 years. It always had my name and who I worked for on it. And just about everybody still asks you who you are and who do you work for. When stressful situations are going on, people don't notice that stuff, period. It's, tunnel vision, right? And you either like the police or you don't. You cross the street if you see us walking on the other side, or you walk by and say hello. It hasn't been a problem with Vermont law enforcement. We're very proud of that. Because this happened, now we have this. It sort of digs at our pride a bit. So that's why I vote no.
Yeah. So Barbara, then.
So it's interesting because it's great to hear what Tom is saying, and I think it's a real benefit to have him on the committee. I have heard a lot from constituents. I've gotten this and some of the other immigrant stuff is what I've been getting the most emails about, not only from constituents, but people in Chittenden County, my Judiciary. So it does feel like putting it in perspective for people and not having people think, oh, don't worry, we don't need to deal with it, when people feel we need to. It's, perception's reality. So I'd like us having law enforcement look at it and trying to figure out what makes sense and saying to constituents, look, here's why we went in this direction. We don't want to do something unconstitutional. And we want to make sure, we haven't heard of incidents, but who knows what can happen in the future, and it's always better to belts and suspenders and name tags.
Yes, Sheila.
Well, I would say in my district, we have heard of instances. We had an instance in where a Williston police officer was wearing a mask
And may have been justified in doing it. There's no-
and may have been, but likely wasn't. It was at an ICE facility, a protest at an ICE facility. And my sense, in the community, was that he was doing it because it's kind of like when a bad example is being set by federal law enforcement, there might be a higher likelihood that local law enforcement follows that bad example, unfortunately. So I think there is a need in Vermont to clarify what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I think it's great that we're having, I always struggle with the regulated being the folks, the ones coming up with the regulations. I think in all contexts that can be problematic. But in this instance, I think that as we found, as everyone is saying, when we tried to come up with the specifics, there's just so the world of police work is so varied, and we don't know all of the hypotheticals. So I think having and I obviously respect what Chief Burke just said, that he thinks that the LEAB is the right place for this decision making to happen. So I can get behind that. I'm disappointed in the decision made in the Ninth Circuit, and understand how it impacts our efforts here. I can understand it and not like it, and that's pretty much where I am. So I would be able to support this. It's vastly different, very different from what was sent to us by the Senate, and very different from what the hundreds of constituents and other Vermonters that I've heard from want. But I understand that it's kind of the best we can do in light of the Ninth Circuit decision. And so for that reason, I could support it. But I just, and I appreciate what Ian said as well. It's like, just because law enforcement isn't hearing that it's a problem doesn't mean it's not a problem. So, or maybe problem isn't even the right word, a concern. So I'm really glad that we can address it in this way. I think there is a need. I'm glad that we're trying to meet the need, and I'll be curious to see what the LEAB comes up with.
How's that?
Just as I feel like this is probably a discussion point, and the only opportunity that we'll probably have to say this. I think first I want to start off by saying, there was the concern raised by 5 of us on this committee about the constitutionality concerns with the legislation as it came over from the Senate. I think it's a shame that it took the Ninth Circuit of Appeals in California to reinforce what 5 of us believe to be the case, but here we are regardless. I would also say, counter to what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said, I have not heard from a single constituent about the need for this, and I think maybe it's a tale of 2 counties. Right. I think Chittenden County has very different concerns than maybe more rural Vermont. And I think that's just a reality that I think a lot of us have. And the last point I'll make is, from day one, coming into this committee and sitting through countless hours of testimony, I consider myself to be an ardent supporter of law enforcement. That's not going to change with this bill or any other bill. And I just feel what I do hear from law enforcement advocates that reach out to me constantly about the legislation that we are entertaining in this room, that feels like virtue signaling. I've said that before. This feels like a slap in the face, and it feels like a middle finger to Vermont law enforcement, who has done everything they can to do things by the book and to make sure that the people in our communities are safe. And for that reason, I'm absolutely voting no on this.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, and the main reason I was having discussion was to see if we wanted to proceed with this versus the bill as we got from the Senate, which we
Well, you can imagine either way. I'm in.
Yeah, no, I just want, that was the main purpose.
We're far from the intent, as Mike would say. We're very, if we're having a discussion, we're far from what the intent was with the bill. It's on camera, I don't know how many times that it was a concern for ICE and not for law enforcement.
I think since the March 11th and I've been hearing from folks who have that concern as well extended to local and state. That's.
I heard from them too, and I also saw a video of them doing things wrong. It's hard to take testimony from somebody who's running a department. I get things thrown at me daily, not daily, close, gestures. People don't like police in certain areas at all. They do. I see them cross the street when they see me walking down the other side of the street. It happens. And it says sheriff and Oliver and all this stuff all over it. Okay.
I understand.
But to stop and talk to me, you change your mind.
I think that's it.
Whether people like it or not, 208 is a solution. Now all we need is a problem. Because people have gotten emails, saying this has happened, that has happened, a lot of speculation going on, but there's nothing documented that Vermont law enforcement has done to justify this. Gotta make people feel better. Gotta make sure people feel better. It doesn't matter if they're safer or less safe or whatever, as long as they feel better. And legislating, to me, legislating on feelings, it's a little sketchy to be legislating because somebody feels bad. And just because that person feels better, it's nothing's changed other than somebody feeling better. And it's gonna make, I've gotten emails to support this too. So those people are gonna be mad as hell at me. But it's gonna go the other way for people who support this, is they're gonna have a majority, and I'm gonna have a majority of people in my district that are gonna be happy with me. But that's got nothing to do with why I'm not supporting this. And it works the other way. There's going to be people that are going to be happy as hell, and they're not going to be butthurt anymore, and their feelings are going to be, they're going to have good feelings now because of something that's not even going to do anything. I mean, Burlington, it's not going to do anything. Because my guess is, since Burlington has the policy, it's probably going to be pretty close to what Burlington's policy is for the rest of the state. So nothing's going to change in Burlington at all. And it's been said by more than one person in here that this is all generated because of the feds. We couldn't pass the original law because of the feds, because it was unconstitutional because of the feds, but we're still passing a law because of the feds, because they come to Vermont and don't act the same way Vermont law enforcement acts. Thank you, Representative Oliver. And I just can't do it. My two neighbors will feel better.
Yeah, before I go to Kenny and then Ian, just very quickly, I've gotten emails from people all over the state on these things, because I'm chair of the committee, but Steve Dummerston and Craftsbury and Randolph Center, and so mine, a lot from Burlington to absolutely, and from Chittenden County, but I have gotten from all over the state. Kenny.
I've gotten a couple real emails from people. The rest of them are all the auto-generated, trying to push their agenda and all this stuff. This is, and I'm going to go on a rampage. This is nothing more than another political agenda about the feds in Vermont and the brave little state of Vermont, how they sick on their own and all this stuff. Well, it's a bunch of hooey. So again, when Burlington goes down the hole that they're going to go down, and the Vermont State Police have got to go in and clean it up. And Oliver's got to go in there and clean it up and all this stuff. And my taxpayer dollars, because they defund the police and they do all this stuff, I'm sick of it. And I'm also sick of law enforcement that does a great job in this community. And when you want law enforcement, when you have a problem in your house, or when you need law enforcement, all of a sudden they're not there. What are you going to do then? Right? It's like taking good citizens' guns away from them for feel good and all this stuff. Oh, I'm so afraid of the guns and stuff like this. But yet they can come at you and God knows, they can slit your throat or they can stab you with scissors and they can do all this stuff. I am so sick of this legislature in 8 years, basically going over the same old thing. And we know this has everything to do with this current administration that Vermont hates. And I won't be very popular about saying this, but you know what? This current administration did not create this problem with this open borders and all this other stuff. And I'm going to go right back to the same thing that just irritates the living hell out of me. Has everybody forgot about that innocent border agent that got brutally murdered by some of this action that goes on out there? And if we didn't have regular law enforcement to go and take care of stuff, where would we be? These guys put their lives on the line all the time. They're wearing their badges. They're wearing their identification. They're not showing their face. If you had granddaughters or grandkids or you had family members and everything like this, that man right there is a target. And I have a lot of respect for him. Not necessarily maybe as a law enforcement person, right? I mean, give some respect for the law. There's some bad actors out there. There's some bad people. But to criticize, to go and corral all this law enforcement is totally ridiculous. I am beyond upset that this bill is push, and I'm hearing about all these damn emails when all you got to do is look at where the emails are coming from, and they're all generated from whatever political activist group is pushing it. And we all know that in this room, and we're all going and using that there. And I'm going to call everybody out on it. I'm sick of that too. I'm done.
Ian.
Yeah, I think the only other point I wanted to make is just that I do also see creating policy for each department as something that also protects officers. I'm trying to kind of put it into like a real world example that I could see like happening in my community. If there was an officer wearing a mask during some sort of operation or something, even that's just for Attleboro police, and there was no policy in place, and like people in the community are really upset about it, without the policy to protect the officer for like why they're wearing the mask, it creates a lot more difficulty for everybody than if there is one, and then we can point to it, showing that the officer is following the model policy or whatever policy has been adopted. And so I just think that given the fact that this is an activated issue, and in my opinion, like a reasonable, real concern to have, that you want your local police to have a policy in place for when they're going to be masked and when they're going to have their identification hidden, that in the dark without a policy, it's just going to make a bigger issue and bigger concern for like everybody involved. And that includes officers.
You're not going to care about the policy till after the fact.
But
It's not going to help
No,
anybody.
I
Whatever.
yeah, I don't know.
I get it. I've
yeah.
done it a couple of times.
Yeah, I get that it would be after the fact and it wouldn't probably de-escalate it in the moment, but it could afterward. And I think that's important.
Maybe we should have Brattleboro go and take care of the situation down there on the southern part of the Vermont border so they don't come north and bug me. And put all my constituents at risk. It's how some people want to have a free-for-all for it.
think that has anything to do with this.
Well, of course it does. We know they're coming through Brattleboro. Come
No,
on.
no, this.
We know where they're coming. We know they're coming from Spring. What are you talking about?
No, who's coming from where as far as the bill is for?
We got the drug-
A model policy.
We got the drug. You want to go and you want to go and you want to micromanage police in Vermont that this bill is criticizing, and we're going way overboard again because of the political stance of the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, you want to keep putting neighbor against neighbor? Let's go for it. Because you know what? There's a lot of us that are middle of the road Republicans that are quite frankly sick of it. It's like this was created years ago and it should have been dealt with years ago, and it wasn't. So we have a bigger problem, and now somebody with some common sense has to try to take care of it with this state of Vermont. And you know what? At some point, I hope it doesn't happen, but you never know. Washington could just go and cut everything off from to Vermont. And you know what? We don't operate without Washington money. Without federal funds, this place ain't gonna do it.
Well, in reality, it's kind of a nothing burger. All right. I just don't like the optics of it amongst our guys. They've had enough. They're questioned all the time. Everything we do, there's always questioned. Okay. And that's not, I don't like an insinuation that maybe we won't be trained anymore. Come on.
No, that's not.
Well, that's what it sounded like.
Yeah, no, I was just
It's what
asking.
it sounded like. We'll put more teeth into it, and it's what it was. But anyway, let's just vote on it, okay? You know how I am and where everybody falls.
Scheduled to
Do whatever you want to do.
So, just to be clear, Tom, I only mentioned the putting teeth on it because Zach was suggesting that it didn't have teeth, and I said, well, you could do this, but I don't want. As for the training, I was just trying to ask Chief Burke if he thought that, we should put in here a training requirement. I heard that he thought not, and so I'm not interested in putting it in there. So I just want to clarify those things. Did you have your hand up as well? Angela, then Zach?
Just a different framing, I think, of it. I don't think it needs to, certainly the political framing is one option, and not incorrect at all. And just, I think there's another framing though that is, as Tom mentioned, like some people are just not comfortable around police officers. And it's an unfortunate reality, and one that I think we should do everything we can to try to address and reverse, ideally. So what if this policy is a way to help with that? What if this policy is a way for Vermonters, because I heard a lot.
But that was never even close to an intent in this bill. Just want to point that out. But I'm sorry, I shouldn't have butt in.
I mean,
apologize.
I don't know that even matters. Even I don't agree with that, but I also don't know that it matters for the point that I'm making, that I hear what's being said about the concern for police officers. That's a valid and important concern. We cannot ignore the concern for the population, for the people whom police officers are sworn to protect and serve. So I don't look at this politically. I'm seeing it as people in Vermont are worried about improper identification, mostly masks being worn when they don't need to be worn. I think it can be that simple. And unfortunately, as it is, because of how the Constitution works, we are not in a position, it turns out, to regulate the identification and uniform requirements of federal officers based on the current or most recent Ninth Circuit decision. It's still an open question. we could pass the bill as as brought to our committee and roll the dice and see what happens. We'll bring our own case forward if it was challenged in court. There's no guarantee either way. We're playing the odds here. And so I just wanted to offer that I think if you look at it from a different perspective, that people in Vermont might actually, that transparency is a good thing in terms of relationships between citizens and police and law enforcement. That, recognition of, I know we don't want to legislate based on feelings, but if you're trying to build and improve relationships, you have to consider feelings. So it's just a different framing. I think that this is a way to potentially improve relationships, improve perception even of law enforcement kind of writ large in Vermont. And that seems to me to be a good thing.
Zach and then Ken.
Yeah, I just have a few points, and some of them are to respond to a few of the comments that have been made in the room. I also agree with the point that Rep. Oliver made in terms of his interpretation of what the chair said. I also took, removing access to the training academies as a veiled threat, or maybe a not so veiled threat. So I did have concerns with how that was positioned. We're talking a lot about police and community relationships, and I really wonder, we keep hearing about how the community members allegedly are afraid of police. Does this bill do anything to help encourage constructive relationships with officers in their communities? Because all of a sudden we have representatives from all over the state that are potentially voting for a piece of legislation, and it feels like a wedge issue that's being introduced by the legislature to further deepen the divide between law enforcement officers and the communities that they put their lives on the lines to protect every single day. Anyone who would posit that they are not looking at this through a political lens, I would say they are not being honest with themselves or with the people at this table. And my very last point is there is exactly one person in this entire room who has lived experience putting a blank check out every single day, kissing his wife goodbye, and not knowing if he's coming home at the end of the day. And I feel like his voice was not taken into consideration on this policy, and it continues to fall on some deaf ears in this committee. And I think that is a shame and a disservice to all of us and the legislation that we're trying to craft to make the state better and safer.
And also to be clear, I've been trying to work with Representative Oliver over the past few weeks to try to address various concerns that he has. I do recognize that I haven't gotten far enough with Representative Oliver on this. So, yeah, the request was a few times during testimony, and including to Lane, I think, I'm sorry, and Tom at the time suggested a preference for a model policy, and that's where I've landed. Given, at one point I had the provision in there saying if a model policy is there, statutory part doesn't apply. But when we got the Ninth Circuit opinion, we took out the statutory part and just have the policy. So I feel that I have tried to take into account Tom's concerns and law enforcement's concerns generally, including from the Department of Public Safety and others. And I think I did take those concerns into account. Any other? Yeah, Angela.
And
I'm sorry, Kenny was next, and then Angela, and then Tom.
So these paid agitators and agitators that just come into Vermont, whether they're paid or not, or they're all here with their whistles and all this stuff. So they're still just allowed to go and do whatever they want, provoke and all that stuff. And they can wear masks and they don't have to ID themselves or anything like this. And they can beat the living hell out of the police department, right? And do all this stuff with the cameras and all this stuff. They're still allowed to do all this stuff. But we're going to micromanage law enforcement. Because no matter how you try to sugarcoat it, no matter how you say this, and you know what? I'm pretty worked up right now, And I'll stay here and I'll argue all night with people on this. That's how much I despise this bill, right? So we're gonna go, come to Vermont. We'll have a big flare up, the big state of Vermont. We're gonna do all this stuff. We're gonna make it like years ago. We had all of a sudden, the free for all for drugs for all of a sudden Oregon's brought up. They're gonna decriminalize everything with drugs. The next thing you know, you got big troubles there. So all we're doing is opening up Vermont even more to have more of a bigger problem that we're not going to be able to control at some point. And what are we going to do? Have the federal, national, or whatever it is, National Guard to come in? We're putting more people at risk. I'm putting my own constituents, and just to be clear, my constituents of Berlin and Northfield are one set, but I'm one of 180 lawmakers that watches out for this whole state of Vermont. And I'm not going to let my political views, I'm going to do what I think is right for the protection of every person in this state. And whether people agree with me or not, that's just the way it is. These guys, they don't have to do any ID. They're very well trained. They're almost like, I don't know what the word is, militias or whatever it is, and all that stuff. So I'm not budging. I think everybody knew who was gonna go and say and do what they want and try to work with everybody and all that stuff, but talk is cheap and you can buy flowers at the flower store.
Angela and Tom.
I was just gonna clarify that the excluding certain departments who don't adopt a model policy from training is an established
Right, and I'm not
concept.
suggesting,
It
I'm
wasn't
not
a
suggesting.
suggestion, it was just that that's what's been used in other bills in the past, not one that was being proposed here.
Yeah, thank you for landing where we did. I think the Ninth Circuit helped a lot, but appreciate it. I have graver concerns over 209. The thing that just keeps going back to is we're legislating something. Our employers should be doing something. They know how to run these departments. They know how to do it efficiently and timely. What's going to happen next when someone says they don't like the color of my lights or the way the car is painted, or I can, see their gun when they're walking? Where is it going to end? How many more pieces of legislation are going to be coming forward? I think this is a bad habit to get into. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, and again, leaving it to the law enforcement advisory board, I think it's, avoids us micromanaging, leaving it to the experts to figure out what's appropriate. Barbara?
So I just want to go on record to say again that supporting this bill is not equivalent with not supporting enforcement. There have been cases, including one recently, of somebody impersonating a police officer in our state. And it's as much about people who aren't law enforcement officers as it is about people who are. The other thing is we know that we have racial and other disparities in our criminal justice system. We just got the new traffic stop study that Stephanie Seguino has done. And those of us that have been on this committee a while heard testimony from people of color who talked about how much time they have to spend when they're running an errand and how many towns they go through and how many times they're going to be stopped by law enforcement. And we do have, if people are afraid, there is a power differential, which my intern reminded me of. Right. And so again, there are lots of different reasons, and prevention is I feel like prevention is a good thing. And I do wish we could figure out how to have people feel more comfortable with law enforcement because, again, I know that young people, people of color, are definitely stubborn.
All right, so thank you for the discussion. And we do have this up for a vote on Friday afternoon, and we can have more discussion there if necessary. But I think the bottom line is 3.1 is the version that we'd be voting on, not 2.1, which was our amended version with the statutory component. So we're adjourned until tomorrow at 9. We have, real quickly before we go off, we have a couple of witnesses on 193, and then we'll spend time with S209.